Today's topic, the ethics of pornography, and a little bit of prostitution on the side. Let's begin with the big question. What is it? What do we think it is? Nailing this down in language is a bit tough. Having an explicit definition that says, all-encompassingly, this is what pornography is. Some will say that because we have such a vast range of human expression and human experience that simply calling it an art form or not, or simply defining it by whether it harms people or not, maybe it's a piece of all of these things. So the question, is it art or is it entertainment? Maybe it's both. Is it harmful? And maybe also might, in some cases, it be beneficial. Maybe it's a little bit of both. This is for you to decide. Who tells us what pornography is? Culture? Some cultures, if you show your ankles, male or female, but typically female, showing your ankles is a form of pornography. Maybe our culture, they have relative views. So maybe we move past that and we'll say, well, then medical doctors should tell us. Well, does that really fit? Maybe philosophers are actually the ones who have a stronger grasp on the concept. I don't know. I would argue that one of the biggest mistakes is letting the porn industry decide what is pornographic and whether or not it's harmful. And I think it's a big mistake to let them to decide the ethics of the work practices of people in the industry. Self-regulation, in other words, by those who are heavily invested in making a profit can be quite dangerous. It's not to say that they shouldn't, obviously these are principal players in the industry. It's not to say they shouldn't be involved. But we as a culture may have more at stake than we initially realized. That is, there may be more involved in the question of what is pornography, is it good, is it bad, than just the individual people participating in it, more than just the industry. It may impact us as a society, and therefore we as a society need to be thinking about it, its implications, its meanings, and whether we're okay with certain practices and ideals that are coming through it to this generation, your generation. Is it something that society should care about? In a liberal democracy where we say everyone is free to do what they want as long as they do not harm anybody else, is porn causing harm? Not just to people who may be engaged in it for a living, producing it, manufacturing, and so on, but for those of us who may be consuming it. Is it doing harm to us as individuals? And in turn, is the harm it's doing to individuals spreading to family, and then from family or marital relations to society? Big questions. Are there good forms and bad forms of this thing called pornography? Or are we just kind of willing to say that all porn is bad, therefore whatever is bad can be called porn? It's a very circular definition. Like art, there can be good art and bad art. Art, I would argue, that is good asks us questions about ourselves. It gets us thinking and engaging with reality more. Bad art, by contrast, doesn't really engage us. It doesn't have a say. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't spur us on to thinking in a different way. It doesn't really offer an experience of anything new. Might we define art and pornography along similar lines? For the moment, if we were to simply agree it causes harm, and that's not clear yet, but let's say pornography causes harm, well, who gets to decide that? Do we then regulate the internet? And who decides that? Do we then make new laws? And who decides what those would be? The big problem here is the risk of censorship. And this will come back time and again, that if we believe it causes harm, any kind of response to it risks other harms. So if we do have one set, adding more harms doesn't necessarily correct the first one. So a move forward is quite difficult to imagine and to articulate. Pornography brings about huge questions regarding freedom, free speech, freedom of expression, the nature and role of art. Is art just something that we see and it's hedonistically engaging, or is art a vehicle for thinking about higher truths, and art as a way of thinking about social responsibility? I would argue that art has a very strong role to play in society, and that maybe in that sense, pornography, in as much as it's sharing in artistic realities, may have a say. But for the most part, it's not clear that it is an art, and this is my own personal bias, in which case it may not have nearly the level of social impact or relevance that art does, but that's a side conversation. We can certainly talk about businesses, how it's a business, and it's businessly in capitalism, in capitalistic terms, how it's a business of exploitation. Someone has capital, they want to make money, they hire actors, actresses, they hire people to be involved with this, and while it creates jobs, one of the leading concerns is that as a business, it encourages a certain level of violence. That is, a domination of men over women. This is stereotypical stuff. This is not necessarily universally true, but the majority of it has that appearance of being, for lack of a better term, abusive. I mean, how else would you explain that lopsided power, weird relationship in which the male dominates? The male is the one that receives pleasure, and the female is basically an object to be used. Again, thinking about pornography raises some huge, huge questions, both personal and social. Freedom. What is the nature of freedom and free speech? Free speech is so important to our culture, but what does that mean? Freedom of expression, but is pornography a freedom of expression issue? There's money to be made in the business of pornography, which raises some pretty big questions about exploitation. And the industry, no doubt, has made a number of changes over the years. I remember seeing one documentary, maybe 5 years ago now, where it was about that, precisely that workers had rights, and they were doing testing to make sure people were safe. And in other words, people have become more conscious and aware of the potential imbalance in a power relationship, especially in all industries, but especially in the porn industry. Of course, talking about pornography raises this broader question of sexuality and what we regard as healthy or unhealthy, not just lawful or unlawful, not just moral or immoral, but just generally speaking, how do we define health? How do we think of human well-being? And does pornography encourage that? Is pornography playing a useful role in that? Some will say absolutely no. It's causing harm, whether we think it causes harm or not, even though it may be pleasurable for many. It's actually causing long-term harm. Others will say it doesn't matter. It's just one of many different forms of human expression. Don't worry about it. Well, this is for you to decide, but that's certainly one of the lingering questions. Along with that is, what is the role of pornography in terms of a healthy family relationship? Again, it's one thing to say pornography is good as an individual, yes or no for me, but what about the impact it might have on my family, my consumption of pornography? If it's leading me down a path of dissatisfaction with my spouse, if it's leading me down a path of, say, internet addiction, if it's leading me down a path of images and ideals of what constitutes beauty, and maybe personal shame because I don't look like the actors or actresses in the films or wherever you're seeing this stuff, then there's a problem here. And it's not only a matter of my own version of sexuality, it's that it's changing how I perceive myself and a healthy form of human relationships. And eventually this will have a pretty strong impact potentially on my family. Something to think about. Then there are the psychological issues of addiction in general. Many people that report internet addiction, they're not really addicted to Teletubbies and watching kitty cat videos online, although those are interesting, right? Who doesn't watch the funny cat videos? They're addicted to the pornography side of things. Not all, of course. I don't want to be too general. But when we talk about the psychological issues of internet addiction, we're largely or often talking about this. That's not to say that pornography is inherently bad. It's just we might say, like anything else, like sugar. Sugar in moderation might not be bad, but this is certainly on the radar of huge questions to ask. So what have we got so far? Issues of freedom, individual freedom, but also social freedom, expressions of art, free speech. What do we mean by these things? It's a business, but what do we mean? Maybe there's business exploitation going on here, which leads us to questions of violence and a lopsidedness in power relationships. Questions of sexuality, what is good, what is healthy, what is not. Family relationships, is pornography possibly destroying family relationships? Psychological issues of, alongside others, but internet addiction. Okay, as just to get the ball rolling, that's a lot of stuff to be thinking about. Here's a working definition. What is pornography? Well, I don't know, but here's a working definition. Sexually explicit words or images intended to provoke sexual arousal. One more time. Sexually explicit words or images intended to provoke sexual arousal. Okay, to fill out that definition, we have two extremes. On the one extreme, we have what we might call the obscene, like the really bad stuff. It's a property that makes sexually explicit words or images bad. Illegal, maybe they're illegal, or maybe they just break a moral code. They're disgusting for whatever reason. It's not just the obscene is tasteless. It's not like when I'm eating dinner and if I have my elbows on the table, my mother would get very upset with me. I keep my elbows. We're not talking about manners in that sense. We're talking about something that we consider morally reprehensible. It's corruptive. It's degenerative. It's something terrible. An example of that would be child pornography. The vast majority of people on the planet recognize child pornography as, for lack of a better word, evil. It's just reprehensive and evil. Why? Because it's abusive, it's exploitive, it's using children in a way that they can't consent to. And this is kind of one of the examples of one form of pornography where many of us are very happy to say, yes, there are limits. That clearly crosses it. People who are engaged with that deserve to go to jail. Maybe they deserve to go to hell. You get the idea. On the other extreme, we have erotica. Again, you could replace either one of these words with different words. These are just extremes, the obscene and then the erotic. The erotic are sexually explicit materials of whatever form that don't harm anybody. They don't have a negative impact. They're among consenting adults, people of a mature mind that can engage in whatever consumption of whatever materials they want. In the material, you don't see depictions of abuse. You don't have bad things in the material itself. Great. Some will agree that there's a healthy form of erotica, others not. Right? Recall some of the earlier conversations we had. Some see all sex as bad. That's not the dominant opinion. Many people see some sex as wonderful and great and healthy, and that's where that erotica might play a role in that. However, some people just say all sex is obscene and terrible, which is, well, that's a possible way of thinking about it, but definitely an extreme. Can porn be beautiful? Think about this for a moment. Can porn be beautiful? Some will define pornography by saying that if it's sexuality and it's beautiful, it's erotica, it's not porn, because porn by definition is this other side, the obscene side, so it's not beautiful per se. In other words, we'd have to change what we mean by sexually explicit material intended to provoke sexual arousal. We'd have to use a different word than pornography because some people just see it as inherently negative. The connotations in it are just inherently negative. That might be limiting, but I think that's probably a safe gamble in terms of what does the term mean. But let's roll the clock back a little bit. And where does this term pornography come from? Well, for the Greeks, pornographein was literally just to write about prostitutes. That's not how we use the term today. Pornography does not mean writing about prostitutes. It might be in some way, but that's not how we use the word today. And again, it's been very, very difficult for people to pin it down. As a famous example that gets quoted quite a bit, the Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, 1964, said, quote, "I know it when I see it," end quote. All right. In other words, I can't tell you what it means, but when I see it, I can tell you. That, for many of us, kind of smacks of cultural relativism. Okay, it may be true for your culture at that time, but that's certainly not a universal definition. The reality is we may not have a universal definition because the word itself keeps changing, as does the content and the practice and the businesses and all these different things that are associated with it. As an example, it's becoming more and more popular to use the word porn to describe anything that's been sensationalized. Porn violence, or violent porn is not what it means. Porn violence is in a non-sexual way to say, oh, look, there's just an orgy of violence. It's not meant to be sexual. It's just talking about there's a really graphic or very clear depiction of something that's violent. Okay, so that's not a direct meaning per se, but you get the idea. As a modern definition, here's some of the things we can say about pornography. Again, it's a business enterprise. It has something to do with money, billions and billions of dollars, selling something for profit. So pornography today is largely about selling something for profit. No surprise. Inasmuch as it is selling something for profit and it's sexual, it does have a relationship with prostitution. So we're drawing some parallels now, but again, not direct necessarily. It has something to do with technology today. Screens and the internet have become the mainstream. It used to be VHS tapes or beta or whatever they were called, and then probably that was the main thing. And now we're into the internet. Everything's free. Your generation, depending on when you're watching this video, but your generation is one of the first, if not the first, to have widespread access to free pornography of almost every degree. It used to be the case that many of us were just afraid to be on the computer at all because they would pop up these ads, and sometimes they would be quite graphic. You may not have been interested at all in finding something of a sexually explicit nature, but the internet would throw it at you. Companies would throw it at you. Well, Google and Facebook and other social media platforms have learned to process or censor these images so that people who want to see this stuff can find it, and the rest of us, of course, aren't just sort of guinea pigs having the stuff thrown at us. Still, it's there. It's there online, free for anyone of any age who has internet access to get their hands on it, metaphorically speaking. It has something to do with psychology and possible addictions, as we've discussed. Given its widespread availability, to any age group, that should be a concern to most of us. My wife and I are keenly aware that our two boys have access to the internet in our home, and it is still quite difficult to censor the internet for age-appropriate content. Again, the businesses, the industry, Google, they're getting better, but our fears are still there. The big ethical questions about pornography. One, is producing or publishing it morally permissible? Is it ethical to be involved in this business? A business that may make people money and get people jobs, which is great, but the means of generating income might be morally suspect. Maybe. Should the porn industry be prohibited legally? Or just maybe some? Maybe we're okay with those forms that might be called softcore pornography, but we're not okay with the hardcore. It doesn't have to be an either or an all or none, but there's a sense in which if it's morally permissible or not, we have different responsibilities than if we say it's legally responsible or not. For instance, we may say it's immoral, but we couldn't come up with a law to meaningfully curb it or stop it, because again, there are so many expressions of this, so many ways in which people can engage in it, that while we may agree it's immoral and unhealthy, whatever those things may mean, then but that doesn't mean the law can actually do anything about it, right? Or vice versa. Maybe the laws of the land are such that we cannot engage in it or consume it in any way. And what does that mean? Shutting down the internet, isn't that a censorship? Isn't that a breach of our own independence and autonomy and freedom? So, however we decide, moral or legal, vice versa, it could be an interesting conversation to be had if society decides it should be legal but not moral, moral but not legal. Generally, I think we can all agree that some forms of sexuality are unhealthy and not okay, and that we should have laws. Bestiality, necrophilia, these are depictions of things that are wrong. But is the depiction of the things itself wrong? So engaging in these acts, for different reasons we could argue that they're wrong. Just because most people think they're wrong doesn't mean that that's a strong argument, but I personally think it is. But let's just for the moment agree that bestiality and necrophilia are wrong. Well, if you're just watching a film of it, and you're not producing this material yourself, and you're not engaging in this material, what's the harm? Is there harm? Should anyone care? You may be tempted to say, well, probably, I don't think I do care. But what about child pornography? Do you care if people have child pornography? They're not producing it, but they have it. If the depiction itself is not wrong, just the possession of it is fine, are you okay with that? And many will respond with, of course it's wrong. It's insanely wrong. The mind of the consumer that wants to be engaged with child pornography is perverse and warped. Why? Because they're taking joy in an abusive, unnatural act in which one of the most vulnerable, if not the most vulnerable segments of society, children that are supposed to be protected from any kind of messed up power relationship and abuse, exploitation, they're being harmed for another person's pleasure. If that's not the definition of immoral and warped. I'm not sure if that's not like the archetype for it. I'm not sure what it would be. Moreover, simply having these things on film and engaging in them, even though you may not be producing it directly, you're just consuming it through your television, your screen, your computer, whatever. If there were no consumers, there would very likely be fewer producers, or maybe even next to none. I mean, I'm sure there would be some, no doubt. But the risks of one perpetuating the industry, even though indirectly by being a consumer, seems fairly clear-cut. So there's an example of one society saying we don't like this form of sexuality because it's abusive and exploitive. And two, just having it, even though you're not directly exploiting them, is a means of supporting the exploitation. So you are connected to that. Okay. And this is a much larger conversation. I'm just hitting on this as one extreme example to sort of illustrate the point that there are clear lines here. But after the issues of child pornography, when we start to talk about just adults, consenting adults, well, that conversation is much harder to have sometimes. As parents, my wife and I have no problem censoring what our boys watch. They're now 5 and 10 years of age. We don't see any moral problems at all censoring their reality until they're a little older to handle it and to understand what's going on and to understand the nuances of healthy or maybe unhealthy. Or just they've never even had relationships with any significant other, so they really don't understand how to process these sorts of things. But eventually they'll see these sorts of things and they'll get an idea of what goes on in the world, and they'll eventually understand what human sexuality is, hopefully, and they'll achieve a healthy life of human sexuality among all of their other experiences and facets. But in a hyper-sexualized culture, such as the one we live in now, which is hyper-sexualized, the far earlier, I would argue, than is the average or the norm, or certainly historically speaking. And maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like our culture is, if for no other reason than the screens and the availability of sexual depictions of whatever. What does that mean for a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old who may not be seeing pornography, but are seeing a trickling down of how people think of sexuality, how they think of relationships? Because while it may be hidden from them directly, for the most part, and I hope it is, all of their peers are having ideas that they're getting from their family, from their parents, or from whom many of them will be consumers of this sort of thing. So even indirectly, while my wife and I are happy to say we've censored things fairly healthily, we hope, there are certainly a number of indirect consequences of that. The anti-porn arguments. Why pornography is bad? Well, among other things, it should be banned as bad because it offends traditional morality. It's offensive to traditional views of relationships and romance and a loving, connected family relationship or dynamic. Pornography that exalts the pleasure at the expense of somebody else, which is, not all forms of pornography, but just pornography in general, is inherently immoral for some. Using it, creating it, certainly selling it, immoral. There's an offense not just of this is bad taste, but it's an offense in the sense of it's dismissive to traditional religious views regarding how God wants people to be in a relationship. We've discussed this previously in other videos, how God wants certain kinds of family dynamics, depending on which religion you maybe have heard of or interested in. Others will say, well, religion doesn't pertain to me. Then the response might be, well, if religion doesn't pertain to you and you're not interested in what God thinks about relationships, then pornography is ugly. The argument is what's beautiful is sort of embodied in a lot of these traditional religious views, but just take God out of the equation, take religion out of the equation, pornography is ugly. It's a very selfish way of acting. Again, stereotypically, the male dominating the woman for his objective pleasure. And is that how we want to think about human relationships? Is that how we want to think about just life in general? That someone takes something from somebody else without seeing this someone else as a person to be cherished, cared for, just to be used. Again, I am generalizing, I'm aware of that, but it's a generalization that's probably true. This is a bad metaphor, but a way of thinking of this is, for those, the anti-porn argument is to say that pornography is like rotten food. Why would you choose something gross? Why would you choose lesser than when you can have more? Now, that's a judgment call. I'm not putting a lot of detail into that, but that's just idea. Why roll around in the mud, smelly, cold mud, when you can have a nice, clean, wonderful life? Oh, yeah, it's silly. You get what I'm saying. Many argue that pornography promotes immoral acts, specifically adultery and deviant sexuality that's not healthy. No doubt you've heard about the couple that was married, and after a year or two, the husband's consumption of pornography goes up and up and up, and their relationship in the marriage becomes increasingly tense, and obviously he's dissatisfied. And lo and behold, he's having affairs or something like that on the side. Or lo and behold, what started off as an internet addiction of pornography has now become just a flat out divorce because he's no longer satisfied sexually with his wife. I have no idea how often that happens, but it's certainly the story we've been told. And I've heard of 2 instances in my life of people who have talked to me. Something along those lines has been true. So that's anecdotal. That's a sample size of 2 people isn't substantial. But the reasoning that this may be something, or the logic that this may be something a little bit more widely spread, seems fairly sound. Are people increasingly dissatisfied in their own love lives or sex lives because of pornography? And if so, does that promote immoral acts of adultery, what have you? Is it a slippery slope? Is it a slippery slope? Like so many things in life, pornography might help satisfy a perfectly natural sexual desire. Just like eating rotten food. If that's all I had in front of me was rotten food, I would eat that rather than starve. Right? Of course. But would I choose it over, rationally speaking, would I choose something less than with negative consequences? That's the argument here, that the slippery slope is leading to something negative. But it doesn't have to. The same desire for sexuality, sexual engagement, whatever those things are, doesn't have to lead there. We can have a positive, because sex isn't bad, we can have a positive view and a positive life and something healthy overall. These kinds of arguments are, I think they're trying to get at this idea that there's a form of sexuality that's a slippery slope that leads towards something with fallout, negative consequences. Everybody has a natural inclination to satisfy their sexual desires. Totally normal, totally on par with what it means to be human. So this is not an argument that sex is bad. It's an argument that satisfying your sexual desires in this way, we're not clear what that is, but pornography in general, has fallout. Personally, in terms of family, society, fallout. So let's find a way of satisfying our sexual desires that doesn't have that degree of fallout. I mean, everything can go bad if we're not being wise in our decision making. We've discussed this idea of family values, traditional family values, are at increased risk because of pornographic consumption. So that might be a possibility. Again, I don't have any stats on that, but okay, let's say that might be possible. But this character side of it, that one's individual character is somehow being maligned, how could that be? Again, this might not be true, but imagine hypothetically an individual that consumes a high level of pornography, so repeated exposure, time and again, consuming this material. Their views about what sexuality is and how to achieve sexual satisfaction change in alignment with what they're viewing. They begin to think that this is what sexual fulfillment is. And lo and behold, we create a generation of peeping toms, perverts. I heard just the other day, there was a gentleman in Canada who had been convicted for putting cameras in women's bathrooms, or at least one bathroom, which is a violation of people's privacy, right to privacy. It's a human right of privacy, right? And this person is a pervert, right? Lack of a better word, I know pervert, you could define that differently, but this idea that this person didn't care about them as individuals, he wanted to take something from them that wasn't theirs, wasn't voluntarily given. And okay, is that what's going to happen? Personally, I don't foresee a generation of perverts being created by the porn industry, but something like that, so the argument goes. People with warped views of beauty and intimacy are being created by this. So character now that reveals itself in unfulfilled relationships, unsustainable relationships, and so on, but personal character being contorted to fit the enthusiastic love life of those on screens. This is a tougher argument to make. I'm sure in some cases this might be true, but probably not generally. And this is the argument that pornography causes harm. Specifically, pornography leads to issues of rape and sexual violence against women. I don't have any proof of that, but it stands to reason that a person who is increasingly interested in violent pornography may be more encouraged in their predisposition to violence against women. That's certainly a possibility. Could a person who is not already predisposed to that and then sees these explicit depictions of men over women, could they be somehow turned and converted into would-be rapists? I have no idea. But here's the subtle argument, or less subtle. It's subtle. There are marginal cases, no doubt, in which someone is struggling with feeling powerless, and they want to feel powerful, and they don't care if they hurt somebody else, but they've just never, that needle has just never gone to that, I'm going to act on this impulse, until they start watching certain kinds of pornography, the obscene kind, as we would define it. In those marginal cases where someone is encouraged to move just a little bit past, here they would have never have acted on it, but here they do. What happens? Should we as a society be concerned with people like that, those marginal cases? And how would ever determine that? I don't know. I don't know what psychological tests we would need to do to say, well, did this person watch 6 hours of pornography and then all of a sudden that needle moved and then they're violent rapists? I don't know what that would look like. But generally here, we want to find out, how can we stop or mitigate all reasonable elements that encourage violence against others? I'm going to say it again. How can we mitigate, reasonably speaking, practically speaking, in a way that doesn't violate people's rights, things that encourage violence towards others? That seems like a healthy goal. Until we realize how many things in culture really do encourage violence. If you're Canadian, you've ever seen a hockey game, it's violent. You ever played a video game? Some of these things are really violent. You ever watched a Hollywood film? Violence everywhere. Movies, sports, video games, violence, violence, violence. Is pornography the same thing as these? No, obviously not. Because pornography explicitly portrays men over women time and time again. But generically speaking, if we're trying to reduce violence against others, there are many things we might censor. And are any of us prepared to really censor video games, hockey games, and so on? Probably not. But it might be helpful then to make this further classification that when something degrades or subordinates males, females, anybody being degraded, then that might require, because it's malicious in intent, that might require some kind of change. And pornography does this. Pornography is a sustained degrading of women. So this argument claims, and many people believe. And we can see this in pornography when there's no other form of expression except someone getting their sexual satisfaction from another person physically, psychologically, hedonistically, but not emotionally. There's sort of a one-dimensional interaction with this person, like the most base, like prostitution in that sense. Prostitution, you pay for sex, you're not paying for someone's to cry on their shoulder, to connect with, to be friends with. So pornography in this one-dimensional sense, especially in as much as it devalues women or the role of women, what do we do with that? And when we have a generation of free pornography available to all, in which the bulk of it, and again, I don't have a stat on that, but let's say the bulk of it does this, well, we have a problem, a real problem. At the level of the porn industry itself, many people will say that some women are being exploited in the industry. Others in the industry as well, of course, would argue that no, we're not being exploited, we're doing this voluntarily. And this raises a number of questions that I can't possibly answer because I'm not in the industry and I don't know these people. But as an industry, people are motivated by money. It's true. And let's say that I'm a woman or a male and I'm saying I'm going to participate in this industry as one of the actors. That people want to know, well, are you doing this voluntarily or are you doing it because of a lack of options? Are you indirectly being forced into the industry because maybe I'm not educated and I don't have a lot of other options? Maybe I want to be famous and, I failed at Hollywood and I wasn't able to get in, but now I can be famous just because that's my dream to be famous, which is really, it's one of those things like you want to be, a hockey star in Canada. You need to realize that is so far and few between that it's suspect to really push your kids to want to be stars. It's almost abusive in a way because there's almost no way they're going to be the next Wayne Gretzky. All right. Okay. Weird how I'm bringing hockey into a conversation on pornography, but you get the idea. Are these people there voluntarily? Even when someone feels like, yes, I'm here voluntarily, when you look at their socioeconomic status, when you look at their history, whether there's abuse or not in their history, when you really look at, do they value themselves as a full human being worthy of respect? How do these things factor in? And again, I can't answer it. These are just some of the questions, some of the concerns that have been voiced time and again by those in the porn industry and by people watching the porn industry. What about the pro of porn consumption, porn production, porn industry in general? Pornography should not be illegal. Why? And it shouldn't be stigmatized because stigmatizing it and making it illegal are forms of censorship. And when people tell you what you can or cannot do, what you can or cannot say, what you can or cannot create, well, that's dangerous. That's scary. Because often these powerful people, they might be erring on the side of caution or their own sense of taste and taking away your freedoms to do it. Now, freedom is I know it's a very open-ended concept. What do we mean by freedom? But censorship, generally speaking, is a form of taking away people's freedom, which my wife and I do with our children all the time. We take away their freedom to see sexually explicit materials, and we have no problems doing that. Ethically speaking, we feel we're obligated to shelter them because they're so young from these sorts of things. But I don't know, maybe when you're 14 or 16 or 18, when you're usually an adult when you're 18, so maybe 18, maybe then you should be allowed to see these. But we know children are seeing things way earlier than that. They're sexually active way earlier than that. And so maybe censorship as a way of preventing people from seeing these things is actually harming them because they're not prepared for sexual relationships. It's a weird way of suggesting pornography may be educating children. And that's not it is educating them whether we want them to or not, but might not be educating them in the right way. But this idea that censorship as an artificial constraint, how do you know what to censor, even as a parent? And to what age? As autonomous people, we are entitled to freedom of speech or expression, freedom of conscience, privacy, so many things. We ought to be able to live our lives as we see fit, as long as we're not causing harm. But we've been discussing some of the possible ways, mostly hypothetical, but some of the many ways in which pornography might be causing harm. Can the person who is pro-porn give a reasonable response to say that these harms aren't real and that they are just theoretical, that they're unlikely to happen? And that's kind of where we land at the end of the day on the harm or not harm issue. We could fight that these things are harms. Maybe some of the things that the anti-pornography arguments are claiming, maybe they're just not harms in a real sense, but at least some of them are. So what do we do? John Stuart Mill famously says, quote, "The only purpose for which power can be rightly exercised over any member of a civilized community against his or her will is to prevent harm to others," end quote. So anytime that someone has power over you, it should be to stop you from harming somebody else. And if porn causes harm, Maybe that's an example of where we should censor the internet, censor the industry, or find a way of having an educated public so that individuals can make that decision regarding what's healthy or what's not. How that would be achievable, I don't know. On the topic of internet addiction, it's worth very briefly talking about what do we mean by porn addiction or internet addiction generally. It's a dysfunctional compulsive behavior, I would argue, basically in which someone cannot say no. Someone cannot say no. That you've done this thing, this pattern, this habit for so long that you just can't say no to it anymore. And you know there are negative consequences. It doesn't matter if you're constantly looking at marshmallows or kittens on TV. You just can't stop. The compulsion is there. It controls your will. And as much as internet porn consumption controls your will, maybe it changes your character, maybe it doesn't, maybe it has an impact on your family now, but in as much as it controls your will, we might call it a dysfunctional compulsive behavior or simply an addiction. And that's for something for you to decide. The internet in general seems to be a problem, right? Whether it's internet addiction in terms of pornography or not, there's certainly a problem there. This compulsion for so many to be online constantly is a very real problem. So we've mentioned that pornography, pornographein in the Greek, was writing about prostitution. And it's a bit of an odd thing, but in as much as the porn industry has something to do with selling sexuality, we could draw some parallels with prostitution. But what about prostitution right now in modern culture? Well, depending on which culture you're in, the laws are quite a bit different. In Canada now, prostitution is itself not illegal. But strangely, soliciting it is. So prostitution is not legal, but soliciting it is. It is, rather. This is confusing. So you can buy sexual services, but you can't sell them. No business offering services for sale to the public can be carried on without communication. So that's equivalent to making prostitution itself illegal. You have to communicate with people to, I'm sure there are ways around it, but as of 2014 in Canada, here's the new law. I'm just going to read this quickly. The new law. Again, 2014. The law officially enacted criminal penalties for, quote, purchasing sexual services and communicating in any place for that purpose, end quote. So the bill ends up treating work as sex work, as a form of exploitation and sexual inequality. The act is criticized by sex workers, and you can find a number of videos on this on YouTube, but it's criticized by sex workers who believe it is worse for their safety, the new law, 2014, than the previous law, because it forces the sex industry further underground. Okay. So there's something here in terms of legalizing personal safety, this idea that, so these aren't even, the moral part of this is the law, in as much as the law is making it harder for women to safely practice, or men or anybody, in the sex work. So what should we do? Should the law be removed? And is that the moral thing to do given concerns for their safety? Some of the arguments for and against prostitution, many of them fall in line with our previous conversation, but this idea that prostitution is a one-dimensional sex act where sexuality is turned into a service for sale. Many people simply find that distasteful. I realize that we live in a culture where virtually everything is for sale, but the sanctity of sexuality for some is something that it makes it special. Sexuality is special, and it shouldn't just be something sold randomly. It's just that base, eating rotten food, rolling in the mud, when there's something so much better available. It's essentially a misuse of sexual organs. Why are you doing this? Well, I'm doing this to achieve a certain kind of pleasure. Yes, but the argument is that kind of pleasure is short-lived. It has long-term fallout, short-term fallout, especially if you're in a relationship, a monogamous relationship with somebody else. There are consequences there. It's just the whole thing cheapens sexuality, and that's sad. If nothing else, that's just sad. The pro arguments for prostitution, well, it's cheaper than marriage, right? If you want to satisfy your sexual interest, instead of maybe you're a business person, you're too busy, you don't have time for dating, you don't have time for marriage, well, prostitution serves a role. Fewer emotional needs need to be met. It makes it easier. in a way. So the argument that sexuality should happen in the context of heightened emotion and intimacy, well, the argument might be, well, what are the opposite? Emotions take effort, and it's so much easier. You won't have a broken heart after this, right? After this breakup, you pay the person money and that's it. Say goodbye. So there's something there too. Not to sound flippant, but that's an argument. Notice that the same basic arguments for and against prostitution map onto our conversation about pornography. A pornography that cheapens human interaction, that lacks the emotion. Well, some will use the pro-prostitution arguments for pornography. It's cheap and easy, and it's free, and it's accessible, and it meets your sexual desires without any emotional attachments. The response from the other side is that if you think a life lived without these emotional attachments is good, you've just completely misunderstood what's available to you. You could have so much more. So don't settle, in other words. I don't know if that's a great phrasing, but you get the idea. So there. What do we do with issues of pornography in a hyper-sexualized culture? How do we think of it in terms of law, business, morality? Is it something that influences us just as individuals, if at all? Or is it something, the question of pornography, that extends through individuals, family, even society itself, questions of freedom, freedom of expression, censorship, all of these and more.